Okay, ladies and gentlemen, continuing on with this part of the presentation, here's Professor Jim Doda.
I would really like to express my appreciation to Bob and Terry Brown, and also to the Board of Directors of this UFO Congress, just for allowing this presentation about the Talmud of Jmmanuel to be given today. Because as you've seen, there are some rather sensitive topics within it. And it wouldn't be any group that you can give this kind of a talk to. I'd also like to give my thanks to Ed Martin for having suggested in the first place back in March that we have a presentation like this involving several speakers that will be talking about the Talmud of Jmmanuel. Now I was going to say, in the aftermath of this tragedy of the attack on America, I think the Talmud of Jmmanuel is even more important reading because it does give you a much greater understanding of how the three major religions involved came into being. It gives you much greater insights into Judaism. It gives full, detailed information about the origins of Christianity, and it does even give some insight into Islam. And these are the three major religions that are involved in the terrible world situation we see facing us today. Now, one point I should make following Ed Martin's talk is that the Talmud of Jmmanuel was written over a many-year period from about 35-40 AD on through the whole life of Jmmanuel during his travels by Judas Iscariot, well into probably the end of the first century. And finally, when Judas Iscariot died, Jmmanuel's oldest son, Joseph, took over the writing of the Talmud of Jmmanuel until Jmmanuel died. And at that point, there was no more to be written, and that was the end then of the writing of the Talmud of Jmmanuel. So that's why it didn't get delivered back to the Mideast area from the India region until early 2nd century. So that's why the Gospels themselves have a late date, because they were first formed from the Gospel of Matthew. But the point that wasn't mentioned is that we do have to presume that not only was the original Talmud of Jmmanuel scrolls carried back from India to the Mideast region, but also a transcription of them. We don't know how many transcriptions. Hopefully there was more than one that might be discovered sometime. But at least one transcription was carried back, and that was the one that was circulated around in somewhere around the Mideast region, probably around what is Turkey today, where some of the early Christian churches had already gotten established by the early 2nd century. Somewhere maybe around Antioch or Ephesus, somewhere in that region. And it's that transcription that got finally worked its way into the hands of the man who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. And so that's why we have a very close correspondence between the Gospel of Matthew and the Talmud of Jmmanuel. Because the actual original Talmud of Jmmanuel scrolls did not get discovered until 1963. They remained buried in this burial cave of Joseph of Arimathea ever since 33 or so AD, never not to be seen by anyone. And so you do have to wonder, how then did the early church come to know that the Talmud of Jmmanuel existed, change its teachings to fit its own teachings, and write the Gospel of Matthew out of it, out of which came the other Gospels also? Well, that's presumably what has happened. The transcription was what was used. The original scrolls is what we have today that were translated into Talmud of Jmmanuel. May I have the first transparency, please? This is just a reminder that the Talmud of Jmmanuel was written in German, the translation that came out was written in German only back in 1978 by it was edited by Edward Meyer himself. And so we have that came out in 1978, and we didn't get an English translation of it that was at all approved by Meyer until 1992. That one came out. The German has to be alongside it, German on the left page, English on the right. Meyer insists on this because he knows how easily distortions creep into any philosophical or religious writings such as the Talmud of Jmmanuel. In 1996, an improved translation was needed, and it came out then, but it still had little mistakes in it. And Meyer is a stickler to try to get rid of all the mistakes. And so several people have been slaving since 1997 or 78 to get a better translation yet. And we think we have it. That's in the 2001 edition here of the Talmud of Jmmanuel. I call it the TJ. T for Talmud, J for Emmanuel. It's another story why Emmanuel starts with the letter J. But this just arrived at the hotel last Saturday, fresh from the printers, and so it's available at the same book table where Mike Whalen has his copies of And Yet They Fly, written by Guido Musburger up there, and Ed Martin has his book, King of Travelers, also there, and some other literature. My own book, Celestial Teachings, has been out of print now for a while, and it will take the publisher, Granite Publishing, Wildflower Press, some time, I think, before we can finally get a new edition out. How about the next slide? This will be the only one I show you that has some German writing on it. So sorry about that. But you have to ask the question, how can you decide whether a document that the originals no longer exist in, since the Talmud of Jmmanuel scrolls were destroyed in 1974, how can you decide if something that doesn't have the originals was genuine? Because if you talk about the Talmud of Jmmanuel to any scholars, they're going to say, well, where are the originals? Even though they themselves just study the New Testament Gospels, which are long ways divorced from their originals. They're just transcriptions of copies, and they only go back to about the 4th century. Nevertheless, if you have anything new, they're going to insist that either you show them the originals, or it must be a hoax, and so that's what they'll naturally presume. That's why the news media doesn't know about it. That's why the Talmud of Jmmanuel remains a rather unknown document, despite its great importance. Well, one way you can try to check on whether a translated document came from an ancient document is by the fact that the ancient documents didn't contain any punctuation until about the 5th century or so. No periods, no commas, no quotation marks. So what did they do in place, for example, of commas? Instead of saying A, comma, B, comma, C, and D, they would have to say A and B and C and D. And now and then, the translator, Isa Rashid in this case, translated it rather literally. He didn't bother to put in the commas. And so you can see it came from an old document, because in German language also they always put in the commas. And Meyer himself in his writings put in A, comma, B, comma, C, and D, that sort of way, the standard way. So here we have a verse in the Talmud of Jmmanuel. Is this in good focus? I guess so. The German word for and is und, and you see und and there, no commas. Translated, this means lacking in understanding. They, the people, cursed the truth, which, however, must come. They cursed the prophets and stoned and killed and crucified them. So this was an example of that. There were quite a lot of other examples of that in the Talmud of Jmmanuel. Now, Next slide, please. How do we decide where the beginning of a quotation began when there was no punctuation marks? Well, in Aramaic anyhow, perhaps in some of the other languages also, they used an extra verb to say and said, like here. But Emmanuel answered and spoke. And you see that second verb there, pretty redundant. It isn't anything that in good English or good German, either one you would keep, but when Rashid translated, he often did keep it that way, just to be a little bit more literally correct. And so when you see that second and spoke, that lets you know that the quotation would begin at that point. Now, the scholarly skeptic would, of course, just say, well, surely if there was a hoaxer doing this, they would know enough to do this. And they would feed in purposely maybe some verses that had that extra and spoke and to try to make it look like a legitimate document. Well, that might be the case, but you can also expect that a hoaxer would slip up now and then. And as you'll see, there's just no points where it looks like there was any slip up. There was no such hint of any hoax going on. There are plenty more indications of this same sort of thing in the Talmud of Jmmanuel, where Isa Rashid translated it rather literally. Now, another question might be, where does the quotation end? There's no end quotation marks either. They didn't. It seems amazing to us that not even the period was invented back then. But so without the quotation mark, they didn't have any way of showing that, and sometimes that led to an ambiguity. And there was one spot in the TJ I know where I quizzed Meyer's group there in Switzerland about certain verse in the TJ where I thought that the quotation mark wasn't, the ending quotation was not in the right place. And Meyer came back with an explanation that did convince me that, well, probably it was in the right place. Then I found another one later. I still think it's in the wrong place. Meyer thinks it's in the right place. But that's just the same sort of ambiguity you can expect without having had any way of indicating where a quotation stops and the rest of the discourse or the narration resumes. So that's another indication that the TJ looks like it was derived from an ancient document that a hoaxer would not have had the smarts to try to figure out, put in it. Next slide, please. There's something also called Aramaisms. I'll have to ask you to put on your thinking caps a little bit for this talk. An Aramaism is when you translate a peculiar expression that's only used in the Aramaic language, and it makes plenty of sense to the people who know the Aramaic language. For us, it would be a sort of a slang language, a slang idiom, for example, in English. But when you translate it literally from the Aramaic then into any other language like German or English, it's going to come out a little weird unless you can figure out what it means, and then you can just give it the proper meaning and do away with the Aramaism. But in the case where your translation is pretty literal, the Aramaism gets left in there, and this one reads, when Emmanuel had been baptized, he soon came out of the water of the Jordan, and behold, a metallic light came down from the sky and rushed over the Jordan. Consequently, they all fell on their faces. So that's the Aramaism. Oops, it disappeared. They all fell on their faces. Can we have that transparency back again? And pressed them into the sand, while a voice from the metallic light spoke, "This is my son," and so on and so forth. And fell on their faces then in Aramaic, it just meant you bow down real low in front of someone to give them respect or to show fear also. In this case, perhaps they did come pretty close to falling on their faces, which is the same sort of thing you and I would do if suddenly a UFO came up real close. But you could bury your face in the sand maybe to escape the sight, but you wouldn't actually fall on your face. which is an Aramaic expression that, again, a hoaxer could well not have known about if this were a 20th century hoax. But most of the indications that the TJ is genuine, which we have to infer from these direct inferences because we don't have the original scrolls to radiocarbon date or to give to paleographers to try to talk about the handwriting and decide if it was written in the 1st century or the 2nd century or just when. Most of it comes from comparing Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, with the Talmud of Jmmanuel, where they have parallel passages. Because it turns out that even though the Talmud of Jmmanuel is very heretical, everything else about it was very useful to this writer of the Gospel of Matthew. It just said what happened, all of his ministry there in Palestine and what happened afterwards, where he couldn't talk about what happened after the crucifixion much, but everything before he could make use of. But everything in it that was heretical or didn't agree with his own faith or the faith of the early church had to be altered or omitted. Where it was just altered instead of being omitted, then we have parallel passages between the Gospel of Matthew and the TJ, the Talmud of Jmmanuel. And we can tell that one is a parallel to the other also by the same order that they have. The Gospel of Matthew follows right along in the TJ's order of events. Next one, please. Here's first example. It has to do with the fulfillment of prophecy. And was his name Jesus or was it Emmanuel? Now the TJ itself reads here, "Behold, the impregnation of Mary occurred 11,000 years after the procreation of Adam through the celestial son Semyasa to fulfill the word of God, the ruler of those who traveled from afar, who conveyed these words through the prophet Isaiah." So here the angel, not an angel in a dream, but the guardian angel or the celestial son who is speaking to Joseph before Joseph betrothed Mary, mother of Emmanuel, alias Jesus. This messenger angel was telling Joseph about what the prophecy had been from Isaiah. And it read here, "Behold, a virgin will be impregnated by a celestial son before she is married to a man before the people. They will name the fruit of her womb Emmanuel," which translated means the one with godly knowledge, and so on. Well, when the writer of Matthew came to that, he couldn't put in most of the other part. I mean, God was supposed to be the creator of the universe, not someone who could travel through the depths of the universe in some sort of a traveling craft that they would not have known about in those days. But but the writer of Matthew could put in the prophecy from Isaiah because he was very intent on showing that Jesus, the name he would give to Emmanuel, would be known as the Messiah. And so this was a sort of a Messiah prophecy from Isaiah. So that was kept in from Matthew, where it says, "She will bear a son and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." So it just changed, or that was his own sentence, to put in his idea of forgiveness of sins as being the key thing that Jesus came to save mankind from. And this part, from verse 22 on, he took from the Talmud of Jmmanuel, but made changes. "All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and his name shall be called Emmanuel," which means God with us. Well, I can't speak about all the interesting things in this verse comparison. I want to just point out that there were two things about this prophecy: that he would be born of a virgin, which can be also translated maiden, if you like. Well, any boy could be said to be born of a maiden, or even a woman could claim to have been a virgin even after she conceived, if she wanted, and nobody's going to be able to definitely refute that. And so that part of the prophecy doesn't carry any weight. Anyone could claim that. And the other part of the prophecy was that his name would be Emmanuel. Well, if his name was Jesus instead of Emmanuel, how did this fulfill the prophecy? It couldn't at all. So why did the writer of Matthew put this in? Well, because he knew from reading the Talmud of Jmmanuel that it did fulfill the prophecy, and he wanted to have the fulfillment of the prophecy in his gospel that Jesus, or Emmanuel alias Jesus, was the Messiah. So he kept it in, and we have this very big discrepancy ever since. And another amazing thing is that the best of scholars, no scholars anywhere, have ever wondered about this terrible oversight, you might say, on the part of the writer of Matthew. Why did he write this as if it were a fulfillment of a prophecy when his name wasn't Emmanuel? There was just nothing to indicate it was a fulfillment there. So this would be a slim chance, I would say, that a hoaxer could have generated this sort of text in the TJ to make sense out of what doesn't make sense in the Gospel of Matthew. Really a low chance. You can never say it's zero chance, because the skeptic would just say, well, see here, we have the verses. Well, they disappeared from up there. We have these verses, and you can see, therefore, this one could be the hoax and this is the real thing. That's just all they would say. But if you analyze it open-mindedly and fairly, you just find it's much easier for a writer to abbreviate something and make changes that fit his own theology than it is for a hoaxer to add things to get rid of an unknown mistake that nobody knew about in the Gospel of Matthew, that's not in any of the literature, and to make it tie in very completely and smoothly with his own writing. So the hoax hypothesis has great trouble here. Next slide, please. This next one has to do with, during the Nativity, was Emmanuel alias Jesus born during the reign of King Herod, or was it Herod Antipas? We read in the TJ that it goes like this: Now that Herod Antipas and his followers had changed their attitude, behold, the celestial son Gabriel appeared again before Joseph in Egypt and said, Arise and take the young child and his mother Mary and move to the land of Israel. All those who sought the child's life have had a change of heart. Now, when the writer of Matthew saw that, it reminded him, I'm pretty sure, of a verse that was in Exodus down here. This one, which reads, And the Lord said to Moses and Midian, Go back to Egypt, for all the men who were seeking your life are dead. And this writer wanted to compare Jesus very, very favorably with Moses. And Moses, was born during the period when the Pharaoh had decreed death for all the newborn infants there in his land. And Moses was spared because he was put on a floating basket or something in the Nile River, and then rescued and grew up and led the Exodus and all that. Well, the writer of Matthew could see how he could make the nativity of Jesus be very similar to that if he wrote his verse like this: Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. Then the astute reader of this would realize that this looks like the Old Testament book, the reading in Exodus, and suggests that Jesus then had just as important a childhood, very young, early childhood, as Moses had had. And there are other things, especially in the nativity section, indicating that the writer of Matthew put in things that point to Moses, point back to Moses. But you'll notice there's a problem here that, this Herod that is written of here in the Gospel of Matthew, that refers to King Herod. If you go back a few verses, you'll find that the word king is there several times. This is King Herod that Matthew is talking about. And the Talmud of Jmmanuel is talking about Herod Antipas. Now Antipas was one of King Herod's sons. He didn't receive the dynastic title of Herod until 6 A.D. And if you read the nativity section in the Gospel of Luke, you'll find that the decree that went out from Caesar of Augustus to enroll the whole Roman world so that they could levy more taxes. This had to do with a 6 A.D. Tax decree that went out from Caesar. The scholars are pretty sure about that. And also in Luke there, in its nativity section, the same verse that mentions that this birth of Jesus occurred during the time when Quirinius of Syria was ruler there. And Quirinius did not become ruler of Syria until 6 A.D. So we have a lot of indications that it was 6 A.D. that Jesus was born. But that conflicts with Matthew, because Matthew says he was born before King Herod died, and the historians know quite well that King Herod died around 4 B.C. So we have something like 5 or 6 B.C. for his birth date from Matthew, or do we have 6 A.D. from Luke? Now it turns out from other verses in the TJ, you can see that the writer of Luke did have some access to the TJ. He got those verses of the TJ that refer to the 6 A.D. birth date for Emmanuel. So what happened here? This is the first time we've had this solution presented to this problem, that scholars have overlooked the possibility that Matthew was the one that was wrong and that had falsified Herod Antipas, who received that title in 6 A.D., falsified that into King Herod in order to make the verse down here be more similar to the verse that was in Exodus about the king having all the men that had wanted him dead, having all the men who wanted to have Jesus killed were now dead, and it was safe to go back to Israel. So this is the first time this suggestion brings all these bits of evidence into total agreement, if the writer of Matthew was the guilty one who made the false change here. And this is indeed apparently what happened. Now the church probably always wanted to have the Matthew version to be the right one, because that made Jesus be 36 or 37 years old, something like that, during his ministry. And so he was a much more mature man by their reckoning than if he was only 24 or 25 when he returned from the lost years in India, we just heard, and started his ministry there. But he had such a very advanced learning childhood. He was really mature at that age of 24 and could do it. But the church couldn't allow any of that either. And so they opt for the Matthew's version of being the correct one, and that's the only one that we hear about. Now, what are the odds that a literary hoaxer could have thought up this solution that's not in any literature, no scholarly literature at all? It's very, very slim. Next one, please. Here's a shorter example. It comes from one of the Beatitudes on the Sermon on the Mount. The TJ reads, "Blessed are those who are rich in spirit and recognize the truth, for life is theirs." Well, the writer of Matthew, when he saw that, he didn't want to have truth being emphasized. You'll find over and over again that truth and seeking knowledge and all that was taken out. If you start wondering what is truth and what's not, you're going to start questioning what the church has to say. This was written, the Gospel of Matthew was written now in early 2nd century. The churches have been established way back since the 50 A.D. or so. So there have been two generations at least of churches. And what the church said, that's what the people were supposed to do. So he had to take that out. And when it comes to rich in spirit, he could understand, at least from reading the rest of the TJ, that meant being able to be in close contact with your own spirit. realize you have a spirit that has power, that you can try to get in contact with through meditation, and you can pray to your own spirit. This was not to be anything that was to be taught here in Matthew's Gospel, because as far as the early church was concerned, the only spirit of importance was the Holy Spirit or the Holy Ghost, the Spirit of God. And that's something that was external. You could pray for it to come into your life, perhaps, but there it was, something outside of you. That's the way it was supposed to be. So he had to change rich in spirit, and the way he decided to do it, he must have said, aha, I'll just change this to poor in spirit. Blessed are the poor in spirit, which we're so used to, we think of it as a very beautiful verse. However, rich in spirit is really what you want to have here, because poor in spirit means downhearted or downcast. At least that's one meaning. And why should you be so blessed if you're just so downcast and dejected all the time? But then scholars have pointed out that it is a bit ambiguous, because another meaning of poor in spirit that came from the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the mentions of it there, is that it's the opposite of being hard-hearted. So it means sort of being open and pliable to doing what other people suggest, not being hard-hearted. So maybe that's what he had in mind too. It's hard to say, because that would have been something agreeable to him, to have people listen to the teachings for the church and accept them without question. So again, you have to ask, could a hoaxer have thought up this expression, rich in spirit, when it's not in any literature anywhere? For that matter, why would a literary hoaxer even want to have Matthew as his gospel that he's going to try to change and make into a better gospel, when every scholar ever since the beginning of this century thinks that, not every scholar, but about 90% think that Mark was the first gospel, not Matthew. And one reason they think that is because you can see that Matthew has a lot of places in it where they call them redactions, editorial changes, breaks in the flow of thought, and contradictions that are indicative of editorial changes. And so they just assume, well, the writer of Matthew changed his text when he was basing it upon Mark. It never occurs to them that the writer of Matthew had some other text that he was changing, namely the Talmud of Jmmanuel. Next slide, please. Here we have the question about whether Jesus brings a sword and what that means. The TJ verse reads, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace on earth. Truly, I have not come to bring peace, but the sword of knowledge about the power of the Spirit which dwells within the human being." Well, this was not too bad, judging from what the writer of Matthew thought, up to the point of sword. But sword of knowledge, Jesus was supposed to be a figure to be worshipped, not a figure who would encourage us to increase our own knowledge of the world around us and what's going on and what's true and what's not. And anything about the power of the Spirit, like I mentioned before, that had to go, that couldn't stay in. And so, what we have left in the Matthew verse here was that I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. He wanted to stop there and take away of knowledge and the rest. Well, this leads to quite a contradiction, because one of the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount reads, "Blessed are the peacemakers." So, why would a man who has said he's blessing the peacemakers then say that he came not to bring peace but a sword? So, that just doesn't make sense, and this tells you how this came about. Looking at the Talmud of Jmmanuel, and it's just more plausible that the Talmud of Jmmanuel could get abbreviated this way for the reasons that are quite obvious, than that the TJ could have been a verse built up from the Gospel of Matthew. But again, you can't say it's 100% certainty. You can maybe just attach a 10% chance that this verse could be a hoax, and a 90% chance that it isn't. Next one, please. Here's a question about who's first and who's last. The TJ verse in this point, Emmanuel was prophesying about the people of the future. And here he said, many will be first among the human people because they will think humanely in their false teachings, but they will be last in spiritual knowledge and small in their wisdom. Well, if you think about it, that seems to apply to perhaps the secular humanists, who are really great people and they're greatly respected in terms of the good deeds they do for tending to the poor, rushing to aid in disasters, all kinds of things like that. We really need them. But yet, so many of them don't know anything about the human spirit. And so Emmanuel's just saying that they will be last in spiritual knowledge and small in their wisdom. Well, when the writer Matthew came to that, he could go along with the first part, many will be first. But then he didn't want to have anything about false teachings. You don't want to have people start wondering, are the teachings we receive from the church false? That had to go. And nothing about spiritual knowledge could last, and nothing about wisdom. Jesus was a figure to be worshipped, not a figure to urge us to increase our wisdom. So what did he have? He could have the first part here. The writer of Matthew could end up with, but many that are first. And then he had to leave everything out until he came to last. And that's what he had. But many that are first will be last. And then this was his own invention here, and then the last will be first, and the last first. And so scholars have quite a time with this verse in Matthew because there's so many interpretations. You have to feed in a lot of words to make sense. I think most people would believe, and I tend to think that the writer of Matthew, what he had in mind was that many that are first on earth and they're mighty and proud and haughty will be the last in heaven, or the last to get into heaven, probably the last in heaven. And many that are the most lowly and downcast will be the first in heaven. But then that raises question, are there different levels in heaven that Jesus never taught about? There's the highest up in heaven, and then you get lower and lower in heaven till you find the downtrodden there. But then maybe the ones that are last in heaven will be first. That's what it says here, and then the last first. And so that keeps flipping back and forth. So this is the sort of nonsense you get if you just abbreviate something that does have sense. You abbreviate it too much. You take out way too many words. And it is much more plausible that an editor would take something that makes sense, but something that conflicts with his own theology, leave out the words that he doesn't like, and end up with something that doesn't make much sense than it is for someone to go the other way around and build a nice, meaningful sentence out of just a short bit of nonsense using the words first and last, and have it fit well into the rest of the TJ text without any change of subject or any apparent seams in the flow of the text. So again, I would say that's really a low possibility of a hoax there. That it's so much easier just to abbreviate for an editor. Next one, please. This next one talks about what happens after Emmanuel was arrested. And he was brought before the Jewish High Council, the Sanhedrin, and they declared him guilty of blasphemy after he said a lot of things that really were blasphemous, a lot more so than what's in the Gospels. And that made them so upset that this is what they did. They beat him with their fists and spat into his face, and some of them struck him from behind and said, "Prophesy, you great King of wisdom and son of a celestial son. Who is it that's beating you?" Well, the writer of Matthew kept most of that in. To his credit, he didn't take out the spitting in the face and the striking part. And he kept in the prophecy. Prophesy to us. He called him Christ, of course, rather than the son of a celestial son. Although Christ really wasn't the title that he would have had at that time before he'd been crucified or anything. Who is it that struck you? He kept that in. Well, ever since scholars have been looking into the Gospels, they found that this has a big problem with it, this Matthew verse. Because if they were standing in front of Emmanuel, alias Jesus, spitting in his face and hitting him, then they wouldn't have said, prophesy to us. Who is it that's hitting you? And there he is hitting him, showing him just who was doing it. What the writer of Matthew left out was, and some of them struck him from behind. So they were hitting him from behind, some of them, and those were the ones who were calling out, saying, prophesy to us. Who is it that's beating you? He couldn't see who was doing it. They were behind him. And it's a good bet that the reason he left that out was because that's the most cowardly thing you could think of someone doing. If they're hitting someone, you don't want them to hit them from behind anyhow. And the writer Matthew was writing his gospel to try to convert Jews to the new form of Judaism that he was into, namely early Christianity, where Jesus was the Messiah, but with the rest of Judaism still, most of it still holding fairly firm as far as he was concerned. So he didn't really want to offend the Jews too much, yet he was greatly disappointed, of course, that much more of them by early second century hadn't converted, and instead they were going to the Gentiles to get all their Christian converts. So he did allow a lot of the tough verses in the Talmud of Jmmanuel to stand, but he took out the very worst parts of them. So he took out this from behind, and that left then this question that scholars have wondered about ever since. Why ask someone to prophesy? Who's beating you when they're standing right in front of you beating them? Again, low probability that a hoaxer could have thought up this solution to the problem that Matthew has. Actually, the writer of the Gospel of Mark, whose Gospel followed Matthew's Gospel, noticed this problem. He fixed it up and said that they put a piece of cloth over his face and then asked him, who is it that's beating you? And so that was his solution, and the writer of Luke kept Mark's cloth in there. So if a hoaxer were writing anything, he would have either had that or left the verse out entirely or something, but instead we have this totally unique explanation of why the Matthew's verse turned out to be such a problem. Let me have the next one. This will be the last verse comparison I can give before time runs out. Jmmanuel was very concerned about the truth all the time. Anyone who's concerned about the truth is also, in his writings, concerned about whether that truth might not be falsified. And so this was occurred after Jmmanuel had already shown himself a few times to his disciples after the crucifixion that he survived. And this was at his last meeting with them. The Gospel of Matthew has hardly anything about that in there. There was hardly anything he dared keep. And the TJ then reads where Jmmanuel was speaking to his disciples, "But you, go therefore and prepare the way for my teachings, and make all people their disciples. However, beware of false teachings which you may allow to arise because of your lack of judgment, for some of you are inclined that way. Teach them to follow everything I have commanded you, so you do not falsify my teachings." So he has this big emphasis on sticking to the truth. Well, the writer of Matthew there had to leave most of that out. You can only tell by its place in the text that it is a parallel to it, except for one or two of the verses here have some of the same words. In the first Matthew verse where it says, "And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and earth have been given to me," the scholars have often questioned, well, what's this about all authority in heaven given to Jesus? We thought God was supposed to have the authority in heaven. And there's nothing in the Gospels that say anything other than that. And then here comes this verse that suddenly contradicts the common belief that God is the one who has the authority in heaven. So that didn't look very legitimate. And here it says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit." Well, that sounds like it came right straight from the church. It came from the early church. This was a little bit before they really had a Trinity concept, but it's a sort of a forerunner of the Trinity, the same three things, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, which would not have been anything spoken before any of the churches had ever evolved or come into being. So this is obviously a non-genuine part of a Matthew's verse. Finally, you come to this last part, and teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. That came straight from the TJ. Okay. And lo, I am with you always to the close of the age. Well, again, that seems a bit contradictory, because elsewhere in the Gospel of Matthew, the early Christians were wishing for Jesus to return. They were hoping for his second return, his second coming. And that meant that they knew he wasn't there. They wanted him to be there, to come back in the second coming. But here it says, I am with you always to the close of the age, as if he would never have left them. So every time the writer of Matthew made a change like that, not every time, but maybe almost half or a third of the time, he ran into some problem and made a contradiction, just because it's not easy to edit something, change everything around, and have it all make sense. So again, I think it's a low probability that a hoaxer could have come up with this solution to Matthew's problems in this verse comparison. Now it turns out that, can I have the next slide? That if you assign probability estimates to each of these passages, like I have given to you. Next slide, please. Okay. I've assigned probability of maybe something like 10% or 15% in some of these cases. Over here is the probability assigned 0.1, 0.15, and so on. Where 0.5 would mean 50-50, you don't know whether it could be a hoax or true. And if you had a probability of 0.98, well, you'd say, well, that's pretty darn sure it's a hoax. If you had a probability of 0.01, you would say, well, it just couldn't be a hoax, hardly at all. Well, the thing is that what the scholars do is they don't know how to accumulate the individual probabilities. We can argue all we want over whether 0.1 or 0.15 or what these should be, but they're pretty low probabilities. And the thing is, you shouldn't just take each case by itself and say, well, maybe it looks like it couldn't be a hoax, but let's forget it. We'll come to the next one. Well, maybe not. And what you don't realize is that these can be accumulated in a mathematical way. You multiply all these probabilities together. Call them P, P1, P2, P3. Multiply them. This would be P1 here, P2, probabilities 10% or 15. And also you multiply together 1 minus P1, 1 minus P2, and so on. And then the final accumulated probability from these individual independent pieces of evidence that all bear on the same question: is Matthew formed out of the TJ, or was the TJ a hoax formed out of Matthew? The same question. You just divide the first product by the sum of that first product plus the second product. When you do that here for these 7 passages that I compared, you end up with a probability of about 1 in a million, 10 to the minus 6 here, that it could be a hoax. Now the point is there are about 280 other verses you can make these comparisons against, where the verses are sufficiently independent and the different reasoning is used as to why they came into being in that way that they did. And they all have probabilities, almost all of them, below 0.5 themselves. And when you multiply all 290 or so of them together, you can see you're going to get an astronomically small chance that it's a hoax. In fact, the chances that it's a hoax are smaller than anything else you could ever count on, I think, just about. Next slide, please. I just have to refer you to my website to if you're interested in looking into any of these other cases and the derivation and also that mathematical formulation. Next slide. Oh. Okay, that's my website up here. We'll leave this up if there's enough time afterwards. Here's a Granite Publishing, their website, Wildflower Press. Actually publishes as a TJ, their website, or if you don't get around to buying a copy of the TJ here or want to think it over and whatever, you can always call this number here and order one for the future. So with that, I hope we do have finally maybe some time for questions. So let me bring it to a close now. Thanks for being such a good attentive audience. Maybe someone could shout out a question then.
Hi. Whoa. Okay. It's working now. It sounds like an off-the-wall question, but I'm just curious. What is the Aramaic word that was translated into and what is the Greek word that was translated to the final word of metallic?
Metallic?
Yeah. What was the original Aramaic word and then what was it translated to?
Well, we don't know exactly. We just know the German word, you see, and that would be, I guess, metallisch. So when Rashid translated it, he saw something in there that had the word referred to metal of some sort. And of course they had metal, they had iron and copper and bronze.
Right. But you don't know the Aramaic?
No, we don't have the originals. That's the whole point. We have to be indirect here. Scholars want the direct evidence, and so they are not eager to have anything to do with the Talmud of Jmmanuel.
I lost something from Ed's talk to your talk. Did Billy Meyer and that person he was with take the scrolls that they found and then Billy transcribed them, or somebody did transcribe them?
Rashid was the one who translated them from the Aramaic then into Billy's language, which is German, Swiss German. And Rashid took many years to do this between 1963 and about by 1970, he had mailed Billy a couple of packets of his transcriptions in to go up to the full length of the Talmud of Jmmanuel. But he kept translating the rest for a ways until 1974 when his project got recognized by some religious authorities there. And so they flushed him out of Jerusalem. He had to flee for his life. He took the scrolls and his family with him, went to a Lebanese refugee camp. But he was discovered there too, fairly soon afterwards, I guess, in a bombing raid in June of 1974. That's what we deduce was the bombing raid that got to him, flushed him out of there. But when he had to leave there so fast, that's where he had to leave his scrolls and the rest of the translations behind, and they burned up in the conflagration. The whole refugee camp was just burned up, along with several other refugee camps that were bombed there on June 18th, 19th, and 20th in 1974. So.
In what language did Matthew write in?
What language did who write in?
What language was the gospel originally written in?
Aramaic, because it was written by Judas Iscariot. And so that was the language. He was, incidentally, the designated writer for the 12. And that's discussed in the Talmud of Jmmanuel. You'd have to wonder why in the Gospel of Matthew is there no designated writer given. Well, Judas Iscariot, because of the false rumor that got going, was thought to be the betrayer, the worst possible person you could think of. You wouldn't ever want to say that he was the writer of the Gospel of Matthew. So the guy who wrote the Gospel of Matthew using the TJ had to settle for some other name for the author and decided to call it Matthew, referring probably to the disciple Matthew.
In light of your findings, how would a Christian believer in the Bible view the reliability of what is being taught? Is it all speculative, or how do we view now being told your whole life, the background that I came from, that this is the inspired word of God, correct in every verse? How do we view the reliability of the Bible?
The TJ here isn't the word of God. You know, it's the writing of Judas Iscariot, just saying what happened during the ministry of Emmanuel and what Emmanuel taught. Now, Emmanuel survived the crucifixion and therefore was there to dictate to Judas everything he remembered, including things that happened when nobody else was around that could have told things to the disciples if you believe the Gospel of Matthew. But how does a Christian believe then in the Gospels as we have them today? Well, they just accept it all on faith. But if you get curious to do something else other than that, then you start learning about the Meyer case and how this TJ was discovered, and you may start looking into all these indirect indications that it's real and genuine, and you would understand it's so heretical that it's perfectly understandable that the highest authorities made sure that the original scrolls would get destroyed one way or another. So that's the state we're in today. Nobody has this forced upon them, but it's just up to them to look into it for themselves if they're interested.
Does this shed any more light, or I don't know, it's probably a wrong question, but on the notion of Jesus as Messiah? Does it say that, does it shed any light on him either way, in a sense?
Yeah, you would conclude, I think, that he was the Messiah figure that was prophesied by the Old Testament, but you would have to also conclude that a lot of what was prophesied, or what was written in the Old Testament, from the prophets, from Isaiah and Jeremiah, got altered and left out too. So it indicates that Emmanuel was really a much greater prophet than even the New Testament gives him any credit for, because he could prophesy all the way into our time. And of course, this is just another reason why a scholar would just sort of laugh at the TJ. They'd read something like what Ed Martin read towards the end about how we're going to suffer great calamities here, and the Jewish people would be suffering for a long time to come because of the problems they had incurred upon the Palestinians, the people that lived in Canaan and so on. They would just say, well, that's just hindsight put in by a hoaxer, and just make that conclusion automatically. They wouldn't even think twice about it.
Could you comment on the fact that there don't appear to be any photographs of it, in light of the Dead Sea Scrolls were photographed considerably by the time he would have been publishing? And second, have you talked to anybody in the Lamsa family that translated Aramaic documents into the Lamsa Bible about this?
Yeah, the last question, I have corresponded with Lamsa a little bit, and I respect his ability to translate Aramaic, the old Aramaic. But as far as he's concerned, the Gospel of Matthew that he prefers to read about is scarcely any different from the Gospel we have today. It is nothing like the TJ. And so he just has the same starting point that everyone else does, and just has a few quirks to it. Now, the first part of the question, once again, as a reminder.
Comment on the lack of photographs.
Yeah. Well, my own guess is that what could Rashid do to get it photographed and get the photographs developed and not give away his project? I think he had to be very careful about that. He couldn't even take the scrolls probably out into the sunlight to get enough light to try to photograph it if he had a camera with a good enough lens. And we don't know that he did. And he probably wouldn't have trusted sending it out to be developed. But beyond that, we don't really know for sure whether he might have had some photographs and they got destroyed. But anyhow, they didn't get to Meyer, or if they did, Meyer's still withholding them. We do have one rumor that says that they went to, they were taken up an Ascot ship soon after they discovered this, that Ed Martin told a bit of this story, I believe he did. And they went on to England after that and dropped in on a British museum, not knowing which museum even it was, and tried to show it to some people there, and they wanted to keep the scrolls and look at it for a long time, but Meyer and Rashid wouldn't allow that, and so they asked if they could photograph it, and they said yes. They took some photographs. That was back in 1963, and we don't know what museum. We haven't heard anything more about it. What do we do to find out? So, is there any possibility there? I hope there is, but I do intend to look into it if I can.
There seems to be other researchers who have discovered literatures that purport being written by other disciples and followers of Emmanuel, such as the work of Glenn Kimball. Do you find validity in these researchers' discoveries or exposés on other followers who have written? Have you found